is everyone?
Hi.
Oh, there's some background noise. I'm going to mute everyone, but you can unmute yourself. Actually, I think that's fine. It's actually okay. So today we are going to be focusing on secondary sources. Last week we looked at primary sources, so this week we are going to continue on and look at secondary sources. Okay, objectives. Participants will be able to identify secondary sources and explain how secondary sources are used in research. Oh, too many. Okay, community guidelines. Obviously, we are happy if you're here. If you are late or have technical issues, please join the conversation as you are able to. So if you have to leave and come back, that's fine. You can just join in as you're able to. Mute yourself when you are not talking, but please remember to unmute yourself. Oops, I'm going too far ahead. To unmute yourself when you do want to talk. We want to be able to hear everyone. Please complete the pre-session interactive slides and the post-session feedback form. This will help us revise and develop course content. If you have any questions or technical issues during the session, you can send us a message in the chat box indicating so, or email us at info@hettgroup.com. Okay, so my name is Lisa Vance. I will be leading this training or class. Kathleen is my co-host and makes the slides. Kathleen, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Kathleen Gryvey. Like Lisa said, I help make the slides for these sessions. I also teach English and Spanish.
Cool. Okay, show of thumbs. How well do you understand secondary sources in research? Not at all, a little bit, somewhat, a bit more, or extremely well. So how well do you understand secondary sources in research? On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, can you turn your camera on so I can see everyone? Okay. You can also write it in the chat box if you're not. Yeah.
Yeah, somewhat.
Okay. What does the word secondary mean? Can anyone tell me or write in the chat box?
We can find secondary data from the literature review or other research paper.
Yeah, definitely from other research papers. So it would be sources, not the actual research paper, but maybe if someone summarized the research paper, or if someone included the information in another research paper in the literature review. Good.
Yeah, literature review, yes.
Just one second. What is it? Someone. Oh, okay. So overall, the word secondary obviously means it's referring to second. So you have primary, which is first, secondary, which is second. So yes, we're talking about sources that are not primary. So they're not the original people that came up with the sources. They've used the original source in some way to create their own source or document based on the original. Okay, so let's look at this here. I can't believe Kathy did that. I didn't see it myself, of course, but I heard it from Mo. She wasn't there either, but she read about it on Ang Zhao's Facebook Facebook post. I think Kathy must have texted Ong Zhao about it, or else he wouldn't have known either. So what is this an example of? What did we just read?
This is a secondary.
Yeah, it's secondary. Why is it secondary?
Secondary.
She
Yeah.
talk about answer posts. Yeah, she see another. She talk about other information.
Yeah, definitely. Oh no, Kathleen, I can't see the chat box. Would you be able to read it out for me if you can see it?
Yes, it's still answering the previous question, saying that a secondary is another source driven from a primary source.
Oh, okay, okay. So yeah, so everyone here is talking about Kathy, but but it's not saying, it's not talking directly to Kathy. So it's talking about what she did, but no, not talking directly to her or finding the information out directly from her. It's someone else has told someone else who has told someone else. So this is a form of gossip or like a rumor or something like this. So you're not hearing it from the original person, you're hearing it from someone else who heard it from someone else who heard it from the original person. What is the problem with gossip?
Pessimistic. Pessimistic view.
Yeah, it could be pessimistic. Not all gossip or rumors are pessimistic though. It's something we kind of all do a little
Mostly.
bit. Yeah, I mean, it has a bad reputation. But why else might gossip be bad?
Yeah.
It could be true or not. Yeah. So yeah, you might not get the true facts. Yeah. And it may be true facts. It might not be lies, but it's reported by people without firsthand knowledge. So it's possible that the message might change. I don't know if anyone has ever played telephone, where you whisper to someone. It's a game where you whisper a sentence and they're supposed to whisper the next sentence and you go around. And by the time it comes back, the sentence has changed. So the message, when it comes to gossip or rumors, the message can change over time. People might interpret it differently. They might analyze it differently. They don't have firsthand knowledge. Kathleen, what does the chat box say again? Sorry.
It can cause unnecessary issues.
Yeah, it might cause unnecessary issues. How is secondary research similar to gossip?
Because it can have opinions.
Some of the news from the media.
Yeah, it could be, especially this, you might not use this in your research, but an example might be, there might be a research paper and then a newspaper article might take that research paper and make it way more dramatic. They might add a title to it that is super dramatic. Yeah, so it could be fake news, or not fake news, but people can interpret it in different ways. So even if people are not plagiarizing it, maybe they're using citations, it says what it says in the original article, but people can interpret and analyze that information in different ways. You can take a quote or a citation out of one paper and use it and analyze it differently in a different paper. So, and when you're writing you might use some of your own interpretation and understanding to when you're using that piece of information. So an example might be, like if you have a journal article and then the Times, or probably not the Times, but a newspaper then posts about that research paper, they want to get people to click on it, so they'll give it a very interesting title, they'll make it sound extremely interesting, they'll only focus on the interesting parts. So that might be how it could be interpreted or analyzed. If you as a researcher are looking at other people's research, if you say are looking at information from a bunch of different journal articles, you may interpret and analyze that information differently than someone else might. So if you're creating a secondary source, or a secondary source might analyze it differently, because it's not the person who had the firsthand knowledge or experience.
Yeah, secondary data can be misunderstanding and can be misunderstanding.
Yeah, and it could be misunderstood, or it could just not explain everything that was in the original article. It might be summarized. Yeah. So what are, and just to go back to that, obviously that's why if you're reading a journal article, when you're doing your own research, and say that journal article or that, if they quote another journal article, you should try and find the primary source, because you want to know what the primary source says, if possible, so that you're not basing it on an interpretation. You want to go back and try and find that original source, that primary source, to use in your own writing, if possible. Obviously, this is not always possible. Maybe it's behind a paywall, you can't access it, you can't find it, something like that. But it is good to try and go back and find the original source. If it is cited, if it's in the references, you can look in the secondary source, you can look in the references. What is the primary source for that piece of information? And can I go back and find the primary source of information to use? Just because it is more reliable, you do get the original understanding of what it says, and maybe not an interpretation of what it might say. So whenever possible, do try and find the primary source to at least read it and make sure that your understanding is correct. Okay, what are some examples of secondary sources?
Books,
Text, text and
references,
other research papers.
Yeah, definitely. So books and textbooks are a big one. Usually they do not do their own research, but they pull from other sources and bring it together so that it's easy to read. It's all summarized. It's maybe not original sources or primary sources or primary research, but it's nicely summarized for you to read. Articles and essays, so that could include journal articles, like in the section. A journal article could be a secondary source in their literature review. So the actual data they collect would be a primary source, but they might, in their literature review, they might link to another primary source. So again, if that happens, check their references and try and find that primary source to find out what the information is in the primary source, if possible. Again, it might not be. Essays are an example of a secondary source. They are not original research, but they're pulling from original research sometimes to come up with information. Magazines and newspaper articles, like I said, it'd be a bit boring if you published a journal article to the general public. So magazines and newspaper articles try to make it sound more interesting and more fun, and they summarize it in a very fun way. You might get
Hello.
insight. Yeah.
Hello, Lisa. I would like to know secondary data sources can be used like that biography written by other. It may be secondary or biography is a secondary or primary.
I would say a biography is secondary because it's not written by the person there. If it's an autobiography, then it's written by the person. Lots of times, biographies are written afterwards from talking, like from finding other information. So there might be other information that they might look for, and then they include it in the biography later on. So they aren't the first, like they aren't the actual person who experienced it themselves, but they are someone who has went back and tried to figure it out and put it together. So I would say it's a secondary source. Although, I mean, maybe Kathleen, I don't know if you have an opinion. If someone is collecting interviews, I guess the interviews would be at the primary source. So,
Yeah, I would say a biography probably is similar to a journal article in that it has primary sources in parts of it and secondary sources in other parts of it.
yeah, because yeah, if you were to interview like the actual people that were there, that would be primary. But you'd be you'd be collecting a lot of information that would be based on other documents. So that would be secondary. But if it's new information you're collecting for the biography, that would be primary, I think. So yeah, I agree. I think it's actually maybe a mix. So yeah, encyclopedias and almanacs. So obviously they're summarizing lots of information, so it's easy to read. Documentaries, it's something probably similar to biographies, like they're collecting information that's already out there and then putting it together. They might have some primary information because they may have conducted new interviews that have never been conducted before, and that might be primary. But a lot of it is looking at information that is already out there and summarizing it and bringing it together. How can secondary sources, is secondary data reliable to use or not? I would say it's pretty reliable. Obviously, if it's cited correctly. But like I said, if you're writing a journal article and you're looking at someone's literature review, it's always better to try and find the primary source. It's good to maybe read secondary sources to get an idea, but it is useful to go back to the primary and it's like, what did that original person say? So it's reliable to use secondary, but I would say it's good to read the primary source or try and find the primary source if you're able to. But you can still use secondary. How can secondary sources be used in research?
For comparison with own research to other secondary sources, and then sometimes secondary source can be used for our research creation, because we can get some idea by reading secondary source.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's excellent. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I don't have that down here, but I agree with, I don't think I have that down here. But yeah, it gets you ideas. It can help you brainstorm. I think that's an excellent idea. And I didn't have that written down here at all, or Kathleen didn't. But I think it is excellent. Yeah, reading secondary sources is an excellent way to brainstorm ideas of what might be missing in your research field. What gap do you need to fill? What might you be interested in studying to do your research on? I mean, it's summarized, it's shorter than trying to find all the primary sources and read all the primary. It gives you a direction to go with your research. Yeah, and so it gives you a thorough background knowledge. Oh, now my chat's not working again. It gives you a thorough background knowledge of a topic. So yeah, to either what you want to research, it points you in that direction, or once you start researching about it, it just gives you a more information about it, so that you better understand it. Maybe you better understand where to find primary sources. So I would say that's another way that's not directly listed here. But if you have the secondary sources, you can look in their references again, and it might help you find, let me look at the chat just 1 second. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so you might want to look at the reference section of the secondary source to find primary sources, and it can just help you better understand what you're doing. Secondary sources used for analyzing, justifying, comparing to understand fully. Yes, yeah. So secondary sources might compare different studies. So if you're looking at comparing, say, like 3 or 4 studies that have been done in one area, that might be quite useful. It's creating new data as well, but it's basing it off of other primary sources. So it would be kind of a mix of primary and secondary in that example. It's creating new information, but at least like the literature review that it's based on is based on other primary sources. And someone put references ? But I'm not sure what the question was exactly. AA fan, could you maybe explain?
Yes, what I mean is references can be included in secondary sources.
Yes, definitely.
Is it?
Yeah, definitely. References can be included. A lot of times, like if they're not plagiarized, if there's no, like they should still be, if you're using them academically, they should still obviously have references. It just means that they're not the original research. It might be less likely if it is something like a newspaper article or something that's not academic, that's a secondary source, might not have references, but an essay might have a reference, or a review of other articles might have references, or it should have references. So it does depend. Obviously, yeah, like a biography would have references. A documentary might or might not. Depends how it was made. It probably should still have something indicating where the information comes
Yes,
from.
thank you. Yes, thank you.
So why are secondary sources useful? It was kind of already mentioned.
From secondary source, we can find the primary source of the research information.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so you might be able to trace back to original sources, primary sources. It might be a good analysis, interpretation, and contextualization of other primary sources. It might help show how work connects to the larger field, because sometimes a journal article might just focus on one small amount, so it's able to summarize a lot more information and connect it to the larger field. Like, how does this paper connect with this paper and connect with this paper? And it provides a large amount of knowledge in a small space, because again, it might summarize the information together. And it might increase a reader's understanding of data. Maybe the original journal article or research paper is quite technical, and maybe the secondary source kind of summarizes and simplifies the original source so that it's not as technical, so that the everyday person can read the article without getting confused. Maybe they're able to understand it better. It might be easier to understand than the original one where it's just like pages of data. Okay. So Yeah. To make comparison validation, the research work. Yeah. What are some examples of sources that can be primary and secondary? So I mean, what could you use? What are some examples that, yeah, could be primary and secondary, could be used in both ways? Sometimes it's not, yeah.
From our natural science, primary source are theory and law, and then some of the original experiments are primary source, and then secondary source are other researchers. They use the primary theory, and then we can reach secondary source from other.
Yeah. Yeah. So more what I meant, this would probably be more likely in the social sciences than the natural sciences, but it's, say if you have a textbook, the textbook is an example of a primary source, or sorry, a secondary source, in that it has summarized, say, information about electricity. So it's summarized it all together from other sources, and it is a secondary source. Maybe a case study for research. Let me think. Yeah, but the textbook itself, you could also, someone else could have made new data or new information by studying different science textbooks. So, or it could be studied as an example of one. So maybe they looked at what topics are included in these 5 textbooks and analyzed the differences and came up with new data. So that would be an example where a textbook could be used as a primary source, or it could be used as just a secondary source. So sometimes it might be used to create new data, and sometimes it is just used by itself. And we kind of talked about biographies. It might just be a summary of other people's work, or it might be interviewing new people and creating new information. So sometimes things could be used as both, depending on the situation. Or an example is that a journal article, obviously it is a secondary source to the sources that it quotes in its literature review, but it is a primary source in that it's creating its own new data that you are using. So it's a primary source for the new data that it's creating, but it is used as a secondary source, especially in the literature review, to other research in the field. Conference papers, journal articles, yeah. A case study for research. Well, a case study is usually primary. I'm trying to think of how it could be secondary. Do you have suggestions for how it could be secondary as well? I'm trying to think. A case study, how could it be? No, I think a case study.
I think case study is the primary source. I think so.
Yeah, the way that it could be a secondary source is if someone did a lot of case studies on similar topics, and then someone came and summarized all the case studies or something like that to be able to compare and analyze them. Yeah, journal article itself, also primary or else secondary, depending on the situation. Yeah, so again, if it's creating new data, I would say it's mostly primary, but it's secondary when it is using other primary sources within it, especially in the literature review. But yeah, definitely the new data itself is primary. Reports, news. Yeah, news might be a good example of something that could be primary or secondary. A lot of times news stations are taking from another source and they're secondary in nature, but occasionally they might be going out and finding their own news, doing interviews, and obviously that would then be primary. So obviously they're very related, primary and secondary. So individually, you will write about your personal experiences with secondary sources complete only activity 1. So I'll just show you. Where is it? Here. So this is a pretty easy activity, so I might just give you 5 minutes to do it on your own. So just activity 1, have you ever used secondary sources? Yes or no? Easy enough. What secondary sources have you used? I'm sure you've used lots. I'm sure everyone has used secondary sources in some manner. How did you use them? So if you want to just talk about research, you can. If you want to talk about other ways, then that's all right. And then just stop here. So just the 3 questions. So I'll give you 5 minutes to complete those. I'll put the link, and I'm putting the link for Pear Deck in the chat box. So just click on the link and it will open. Okay, so 5 minutes. So it is now 7:37. So I'll give you until 7:12 to work on this. And if you have any questions, just tell me. Okay, so you can work on it individually in the chat box. Okay, Kathleen, would you like to maybe turn on the music? And if anybody needs help, just let me know. So I think everyone answered yes or of course. And I was just thinking like an easy way to obviously summarize it, a primary source creates new data, a secondary source analyzes the data or summarizes the data. So I think that's the easiest way to understand it. Good. Our research papers, good. Like I said, in the literature review, they can be secondary sources to other research that has been done. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I'm not going to force you to do it. It's up to you. Use secondary, it just makes it so I can see what people are answering it if you fill it in the link. I use the secondary sources to understand the selected area of subject. Definitely, it helps with the understanding of the overall subject. Most journal articles, yeah, again, in the literature review, I would say they're analyzing other primary sources. Published papers, and you can also have like review papers and that type of thing. Okay, that's fine. If you weren't able to complete it, that's fine. You can complete it later if you want, or just think about the answers. General histories, yes. History, obviously you can't go back and collect the information. Literature review, knowledge of topic, good. Textbooks and literature reviews in the research paper, good. Journal article that analyzes research, yeah. Textbooks and journal articles, research papers, textbooks, yeah. So again, it's not part of the research paper that's creating new results, but maybe in the literature review or certain types that might be looking at previous research that has been done. Reports, articles, textbook, and other research papers. Books, articles, references. To find primary sources, good. To create new ideas, to compare my research, to know the pros and cons of their research. Yeah, sometimes that'll help. Like maybe someone has looked at the pros and cons of a research paper. Sometimes people like agree or disagree with maybe how the data from a research paper has been analyzed. So they might look at some of the pros and cons afterwards, or someone might analyze some of the pros and cons. Textbooks teach students in class, literature review to show other references. I use it to compare and justify the selected topic I want to know and then create new ideas. Good. Analyze and compare a theory. Yeah. Read and use as a reference source. Definitely. To write a literature review. Good. To prove some evidence. To compare with present results. To review. I use in the research paper to refer research studies. Good. To validate the previous findings in my current studies. Good. I used it in research work. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and just remember in your literature review, it is good to try and go back and find primary sources where possible, but around general ideas, general accepted ideas, then you can use secondary sources. But obviously good to go back to primary sources when possible. Okay, excellent. Let's look at, we're going to look at the second activity. So for this one, I'm going to put people into breakout rooms for 10 minutes. You will see an example of a primary source. In groups, you will explain how the primary source could then be used in a secondary source. And use Pear Deck to record your answers. So in your groups, in your breakout rooms, maybe choose one person to share their screen and then discuss and brainstorm some answers of how it could be used. Or if you want, you can also just discuss, but if someone could write it down, it would be useful. So let's look. So same link, just to show you. So it'll be the same link, but just keep hitting the arrows at the bottom. And then you hit the second activity, so just activity 2. So here's an example. How can you use results from an experiment in a secondary source? So pretend that there was results from an experiment. Maybe they were written up in a primary source, maybe they weren't, but they were results. How could you then use those in a secondary source? So maybe those experiment results from, let's say for this, that they were written in a primary source, they're written in one research article. How could you then use them in a secondary source? So maybe you would include them they could be included in a textbook. Maybe they could be included in the literature review of a different experiment. So how are they used from the primary source to the secondary source? So in your groups, I want you to discuss how can a photograph be then used in a secondary source? Where might it be used in a secondary source? Census results. So maybe there was some data collected, some census results collected. That was the primary source. How could that then be used in a secondary source? Or what secondary source could it be used in? And maybe in the original, what we mean is maybe there is a statement, a quote by someone, maybe someone said something, or maybe someone wrote something down in a primary source. How could you then use that new piece of information that was written down by someone in a secondary source? Okay. So go through and work on that. And here's a link to the Pear Deck. And I will put people in breakout rooms. We're almost out of time, so it will be for 10 minutes. But so we might go a little bit over. There's 13 people. I'm just going to do 2 breakout rooms. So you can share and discuss ideas and have someone write it down. Okay, assign 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Assign 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, if you have any questions, you can hit the help button or send an email. Oops. Hello. Is
I still have a question. Yeah.
someone okay sharing their screen? Opening the Pear Deck and sharing their screen?
Okay. Thank you.
I'm just checking. I'm gonna go check on the other room.
Theo slide của tôi
ကြတော့အမတို့ကဘယ်လိုပြန်လုပ်လဲဆိုတော့ဟိုလိုပေါ့နော်process data ကို process ပြန်လုပ်ရမှာပေါ့Excel တွေကိုသွင်းမယ်သွင်းပြီးလို့ရှိရင်ကိုလိုချင်တဲ့ information တွေကိုဟိုပြန်ပြောင်းထည့်တာပေါ့ data processing လုပ်ပြီးမှသုံးရတာပေါ့
ဒီပညာပိုင်းပြောနေတာနဲ့မပြီးလိုက်ဘူး
ပြေသွားပြီလား
ပေါ်နေပြီလေရှေ့ပြန်ရောက်ပြီ main section
Okay. So how can you use a photograph in a, oh, sorry, I need to turn my video on. How can you use a photograph in a secondary source as valid evidence of something? Sure, yeah. It could be definitely good visual evidence. Photographs can be used to support your research work because it can help you explain your research better. Yeah, that, I mean, if you're taking pictures of your own research, that might still count as a primary source. But maybe if you have pictures from previous research that has been done and you want to maybe compare it to previous research, then that might be an example of secondary. To analyze the research and evidence and authors of the perspective and research information and participants' perspective, yeah. I mean, an easy one is, say, a textbook. You have pictures in a textbook. And a textbook is an example of a secondary source. Not all textbooks, but some textbooks have visuals and images. They've summarized other experiments that have been done, and they include pictures about that information. So that's how it might be used in a secondary source. Census results. To know death rates and population and birth rates and voting and migrant and gender. Yeah, that's in general what a census might be used for. Thinking more about secondary, how could it be used as secondary? Census results will help in writing research to work in an efficient manner. Also, it would help researchers to obtain necessary or correct information for research work. Yeah, so the census results might be written up somewhere, and then you find that information, and then maybe you're analyzing the information yourself. So you're creating your own primary research, but it also in a way, your own primary data, but you might also be using other sources to do that. So it's kind of a mix of both there, primary and secondary, if it's used in a journal article, but you're using other sources. An example of a secondary source of census results, maybe each city has census results. Mandalay has census results. Yangon has census results. Calais has census results. Jose has census results. And maybe someone creates a government report summarizing the census results from all the different cities. So summarizing it all together, and that would be an example of a secondary source based on census results. So when they were made for the city, they might be primary sources, but the person combines them together, summarizes them, and then maybe publishes them as a government document. And that would be a secondary source. It's decided to gather them together, summarize them, and publish. Maybe analyze them a little bit, add some information. How can you use a quote or citation in a secondary source? Introduction and literature review to quickly find out the detailed result information to use in the library and to emphasize. Good. A quote or citation be used as a source of reference in a research work. Good, excellent. That's the easiest way. A quote or citation from one source, like maybe from one article, can then be used in maybe the literature review or introduction of another source. You see that all the time. It could be used in a newspaper article that's sharing about an experiment or discovery. Maybe they've quoted the scientist as saying something from the original research. So there's lots of ways that you could use this quote or citation from one source into another source. Okay, we're almost finished. Okay, just to summarize and review, How are secondary sources used in research? If anyone wants to fill in the chat box or let me know. Again, just summarizing and reviewing. I mean, we've talked about lots of ways, so.
As we said earlier, it's used as literature review.
Yeah, in the literature review. Good. Yeah. Okay, and yeah, we also talked about to give you ideas of what to do research on, to find the gaps in potential research, to compare data and ideas. Yeah, so there's lots of examples. Okay, how well do you understand secondary sources? So if you could turn your camera on, not at all, a little bit, somewhat, quite well, or extremely well. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And if you can't turn your camera on, you can write it in the chat box. Okay.
Great word.
Awesome. Okay, so a post-class feedback form will be emailed out as always. Usually it takes me a few hours because it's quite early for me here. So usually I send it later in the day, but I'll send a copy now. It will also be emailed out. You can just fill it in once if you would like. If you attend both Burmese and English, if you want to fill it in once, that's fine. If you want to fill it in twice, that's okay. And then just indicate if it's for the English session or for the Burmese session if you fill it in twice. So I will also send out an invitation to join Google Classroom. And next week's topic, we are going to be looking at using the internet for sources. And here are some resources. Okay, so we are finished for today. And I know we're a bit over, so thank you very much and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Yes, Lisa and all the participants. Yeah. See you next week.
See you. I'm going to end it there.